He had spent most of the war in the East, where an operation could still turn on a single bold thrust, a sudden concentration of armor that cracked the enemy's hinge before the weight behind it could respond. He understood that kind of war. He had helped build it. Then in September of 1944, Generalmajor Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin took up his assignment as Chief of Staff of Army Group G in eastern France, and for the first time in his career he was standing on the western side of the line, watching the Americans come. What he saw did not match the doctrine he had spent his career refining. What he wrote about it, a decade later, in Panzer Battles, his 1956 memoir, remains one of the most precisely worded and revealing German assessments of what the American army had actually become by the time it reached the German border. Not a compliment, not a flattery. An evaluation, rendered in the measured language of a professional soldier who had been outmatched in every category that actually decided the autumn campaign in Lorraine, and who spent the rest of his life trying to explain why the German method, which he believed was superior, had lost to an American method he found deeply unimpressive. The gap between those two things is the record. That gap is what this channel reads. If the documented record of what America's enemies wrote about American power matters to you, the like button is what keeps it surfacing to the people who want the archive and not the legend. The phrase that a German general said Americans break walls one brick at a time does not appear verbatim in any primary document. It is not in Panzer Battles. It is not in the interrogation transcripts of the European Theatre Historical Interrogation Series held at the National Archives. It is not in the 1948 compilation The German General's Talk, published in the United States by William Morrow, in which the British military historian Basil Henry Liddell Hart gathered his post-war conversations with senior Wehrmacht commanders. It is not in any of the roughly 2,500 foreign military studies manuscripts produced by German officers for the American Army Historical Division at Allendorf and Königstein between 1945 and the late 1950s. What it is, instead, is the most accurate single-image encapsulation of what multiple German commanders recorded in their own different words, across a period of roughly 15 years, reaching the same conclusion by different routes. A summary assembled from the documents, not taken from them. This channel does not invent quotes. What this channel does instead is go to the actual record and show you what they said, because what they said is more damning and more interesting than any summary. Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin was born in Breslau, Silesia, on 30 August 1904, into a Prussian military family with a long tradition of officer service. His father, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Henning von Mellenthin, was killed in action in 1918, in the final weeks of a war the family had given its blood to win. Mellenthin was 14 years old when the telegram arrived. He entered the Reichswehr and, after the transformation of German military power in the 1930s, the Wehrmacht. He served as an intelligence officer in the Western Campaign of 1940, the 6-week campaign that destroyed France, and appeared to confirm everything the German officer corps believed about the superiority of its operational method. From France he went to North Africa, serving as the intelligence officer of the Deutsches Afrika Korps under Rommel from early 1941, tracking British strengths and movements in the opening desert campaigns, and later on the staff of Panzer Army Africa. He was in the desert through the end of the Tunisian campaign in May of 1943, when approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered to the Allies. Mellenthin was not among them. He had already been posted east. He spent the following year and more as Chief of Staff of the 48th Panzer Corps on the Eastern Front. The 48th Panzer Corps fought at Kursk in July of 1943, driving toward Oboyan as part of the Southern Pincer, and then through the grinding defensive retreats across Ukraine that followed as the Red Army drove westward through the rest of 1943 and into 1944. Throughout all of this, Mellenthin was a staff officer, not a line commander. His expertise was in the reading of operational situations, the assessment of enemy capabilities, and the translation of a commander's intent into executable plans under conditions that were rarely favorable and often catastrophic. The Eastern Front experience shaped his professional frame of reference in ways that mattered enormously when he arrived in France. In the East, despite everything, German armoured formations could still sometimes achieve local superiority, find the unguarded flank, execute the kind of rapid concentration and exploitation that German doctrine placed at the center of its operational theory. The Soviets were formidable opponents with enormous reserves of men and material, but the scale of the front and the terrain in certain sectors still left room for the kind of war Mellenthin had trained to fight. What he encountered in Lorraine did not leave that room. The contrast matters because it shaped how Mellenthin read everything he saw in France. On the Eastern Front, artillery was important, but it was a single element in a fluid engagement where armor, terrain, and command initiative could still reshape the outcome after the guns stopped. A German armored column that moved fast enough could sometimes outrun the Soviet fire plan entirely. In Lorraine, in the autumn of 1944, that margin had been closed. The American artillery network was mobile enough, flexible enough, and supplied with enough ammunition that outrunning it was not a meaningful option for an armored force moving on roads that were under observation. The doctrinal solution Mellenthin had spent 3 years refining, the rapid flanking thrust through the unguarded point, required a gap to exist and to persist long enough for the exploitation to reach it. American artillery and air power together were designed to prevent those gaps from existing or persisting. Mellenthin understood this by late October of 1944. What he did not quite know how to say, and what Panzer Battles circles around for 30 pages without landing on, is that the Americans had built a system precisely calibrated to defeat the method he believed in, not by accident, by intention. He arrived as Chief of Staff of Army Group G in September of 1944 under General de Panzertruppe Hermann Balck. The Army Group was responsible for the sector of the Western Front in Alsace-Lorraine and the Saar, facing Patton's Third Army and, to the south, General Alexander Patch's Seventh Army. The divisions in the line were, as Mellenthin described them in Panzer Battles, a conglomerate of survivors, many at a fraction of their authorized strength, stripped of heavy equipment, dependent on improvised logistics in a theater where Allied air power had turned daylight road movement into a prolonged form of attrition. Behind them, the Siegfried Line, the West Wall in German terminology, waited as the last prepared defensive belt before the Rhine. Mellenthin held that assignment from September through November of 1944, when both he and Balck were briefly relieved following a failed counterattack near Baccarat in Lorraine. He then took command of the 9th Panzer Division from late December of 1944, serving through the later phase of the Ardennes offensive. After that, Chief of Staff of the 5th Panzer Army through the final weeks. He surrendered to British forces on 3 May 1945, held in internment for roughly 2.5 years, released in 1948. He emigrated to South Africa, founded Trek Airways, later represented Lufthansa in Africa, and died in Johannesburg on 28 June 1997, at 92. He had lived long enough to see his memoir adopted as standard reading at American military staff colleges, assigned to the officers of the army whose method had broken his. Panzer Battles was published in West Germany in 1956. The English translation, done by H. Betzler and edited by L.C.F. Turner with a foreword by General Sir Francis Tucker, appeared from the University of Oklahoma Press the same year, 458 pages. The chapters on the Western Front, where American forces are the subject, are a fraction of that total. Mellenthin spent far more of the book on the East, where he had spent far more of the war. But the Western chapters read most strangely now, because in them you can watch a precise professional mind grapple with a method of war it cannot fit into any existing framework. What is striking in those pages is not what he concedes. It is what the operational record forces him to acknowledge even as he searches for language to diminish it. The first thing Mellenthin noted about American forces in Lorraine, and the thing that every German commander on the Western Front independently noted from the first weeks of the Normandy campaign onward, was the artillery. Not the individual gun, not the caliber, the system. American field artillery in the autumn of 1944 was not simply heavier than its German equivalent, though it was. It was organized, controlled, and coordinated in ways that produced effects. German doctrine had not anticipated, and German supply lines could not replicate under any conditions that existed in the theater. The American system combined centralized fire direction with decentralized execution. A single forward observer attached to an infantry battalion could, within minutes of identifying a target, reached not only his own battalion's guns but the regimental artillery, the divisional artillery, and in many cases the corps artillery battalions operating in general support behind the division. The radio-controlled fire direction network, built around a fire direction center at each echelon, allowed multiple batteries to mass on a single target faster than German doctrine assumed was physically possible. The technique called time on target, in which dispersed batteries at different locations calculated their firing data so that all rounds arrived simultaneously rather than in sequence, was designed specifically to eliminate the interval between salvos in which soldiers under fire could normally take cover and survive. There was no interval. The rounds arrived together, from guns that had not been registered as collocated positions. Mellenthin wrote of American artillery in Panzer Battles with language that is measured and military in its precision but blunt in what it adds up to. He described ammunition expenditure that German supply officers in the same theatre would have found incomprehensible, a sustained drum fire that denied German forces the ability to move, reinforce, or concentrate in daylight along any road junction within observed range. He wrote of the impossibility of executing the rapid counterattack that German armoured doctrine required when every identified position could expect observed fire within minutes of detection. German artillery officers in the Foreign Military Studies manuscripts returned to this disparity as a structural fact that bent every defensive calculation from Normandy to the Rhine. The American field artillery, as the Army's own official historians documented, fired more rounds in the European theatre than any other arm of service. After the supply crisis of September 1944 was resolved, American artillery commanders were rarely seriously short of ammunition. Their German counterparts were rationing shells. The standard German field artillery piece in the summer of 1944 was the 105mm light field howitzer, supplemented by the 150mm heavy field howitzer. Both were capable weapons in trained hands. The problem was not the guns. The problem was the shells behind the guns and the radio network in front of them. By the autumn of 1944, a typical American infantry division could call on its own 4 artillery battalions, additional corps battalions in general support, and in major operations, the massed fires of multiple divisions coordinated at corps level. A German Volksgrenadier division defending the same front was operating at fractions of its authorized ammunition allocation. These formations, which made up an increasing share of German defensive strength from September of 1944 onward, were built from convalescents, older age groups, Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine personnel transferred to the infantry, and survivors of units destroyed in Normandy and the East. Their artillery was reduced, their communications were stretched, their ammunition was rationed. Mellenthin understood this disparity when he arrived. What Panzer Battles never quite resolves is whether the material gap was the cause of German defeat in the West, or whether it was itself a symptom of strategic failures that predated everything he is describing. He chose to treat it as the former. The scholarly literature that has engaged his memoir seriously has, in the 70 years since, made a reasonable case for the latter. That argument belongs on the table, and we'll return to it. But first, the testimony from the man who was standing directly underneath when the American method arrived in its most concentrated form. Generalmajor Fritz Bayerlein commanded the Panzer Lehr Division in Normandy in the summer of 1944. Born in Bavaria on 14 January 1899, a veteran of the First World War, a former staff officer under Guderian in Poland and France, Rommel's chief of staff in the Deutsches Afrika Korps through much of the North African campaign, Bayerlein was among the most experienced armoured commanders in the German order of battle when he took charge of Panzer Lehr at the beginning of 1944. He would be promoted to General Lieutenant in November of that year, but at the time of what follows he held the rank of General Major. Panzer Lehr was not a standard division. Built from Wehrmacht training and demonstration units, from the instructors and cadre who ran the Army's armour schools, it was the most completely equipped armoured division in the German order of battle at the time of its deployment to Normandy. If the Wehrmacht was going to hold the Allied breakout with one formation, Panzer Lehr was the formation it would use. Bayerlein was given the best division available. He was told to hold. On 25 July 1944, the American First Army under General Omar Bradley launched Operation Cobra. The ground assault was preceded by the largest close-air support effort American forces had yet attempted. Approximately 1,500 heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force flew in successive waves over the Panzer Lehr sector, dropping fragmentation bombs and high explosives. Around 550 fighter bombers of the 9th Air Force worked the flanks and forward positions before and after the heavy bombers. Roughly 380 medium bombers of the 9th Air Force completed the sequential air effort. The combined attack struck a corridor approximately 6,000 meters wide and 2,500 meters deep. After the bombers came the artillery of the American 7th Corps and 8th Corps. 522 guns allotted 170,000 rounds for the opening of the ground assault. Bayerlein survived that day. He gave his account to American interrogators after the war and repeated closely related descriptions in his foreign military studies manuscripts produced for the American Army Historical Division. Those manuscripts are held in Record Group 549 at the National Archives and Records Administration, with research copies at the United States Army Heritage and Education Center at Carlisle in Pennsylvania. He told his interrogators that by midday, the entire sector of Panzer Lehr's forward positions resembled what he called a moon landscape, with bomb craters touching rim to rim. Artillery positions obliterated, tanks overturned and buried in the earth. Infantry positions flattened, all roads and tracks cut. Signal communications severed across the entire front. No command was possible over any part of the line. He said the shock effect on his surviving troops was indescribable. Some of them, overwhelmed by the concussion and duration of the bombardment, ran from their positions into the open, where they were cut down by fragments. When an emissary from Field Marshal Gunther von Klug, commanding Army Group B, reached Bayerlein's headquarters that afternoon and said the St. Lo to Pirias line must be held at all costs, that not a single man should leave his position, Bayerlein's reply, as recorded in his subsequent accounts, was simple. He said everyone out front was holding his position. Every grenadier, every engineer, every tank crew, none were leaving their posts. They were lying silent in their foxholes, because they were dead. The Panzer Lehr Division, the best-equipped armoured formation in the Wehrmacht on the Western Front, had been destroyed in a single operational day, not by a brilliant flanking movement, not by a rupture through concentrated armour, by the systematic, layered application of heavy bombers, then medium bombers, then fighter bombers, then massed artillery, then ground assault, each arm completing what the previous arm had begun. There is a further detail about Cobra that the German commanders who wrote about it did not have access to at the time, and that American commanders did not publicize. On 24th July, Cobra had been attempted and aborted due to cloud cover, but many bombers had already released before the recall order reached them. Those short drops killed 25 American soldiers and wounded 131 in the 30th Infantry Division sector. On 25th July, a second series of short drops from American aircraft killed 111 American soldiers and wounded 490. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie J. 20 McNair, the commander of Army Ground Forces, who had gone forward to a frontline position to observe the assault. Bradley and Collins did not stop the attack. They adjusted the safety corridor, absorbed the tragedy, and continued. The assault broke through. Panzer Lehr was destroyed. The exploitation began. The German after-action accounts do not record that the American attack hesitated or reoriented after the friendly fire incidents, because it did not. The system continued to function through an error that would have paralyzed many other armies' operations entirely. That continuity is itself part of what the German professional record is describing when it talks about American forces as something that kept coming regardless of what happened to them. This is the situation Mellenthin inherited when he arrived at Army Group G 2 months later. The Lorraine campaign that followed, running from September through December of 1944, has been documented in Hugh M. Cole's official army history, The Lorraine Campaign, published in 1950, examined by Roman Jaromowicz in Tank Tactics. From Normandy to Lorraine, and studied through American unit records by Michael Dubler in Closing with the Enemy, How GIs Fought the War in Europe, published by the University Press of Kansas in 1994. What those months show, across the operational record, is a sustained application of the same combination Bayerlein had described from the receiving end: artillery preparation, air interdiction of German movement, infantry armor assault, and then, when German forces counterattacked, the same cycle applied before they could achieve concentration. The clearest single example came in late September. The Battle of Araucourt ran from the 19th through the 29th of September in the open country of the Saar Basin south of Nancy. Elements of General de Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army launched a counter-offensive designed to cut off Patton's overextended spearheads, committing Panther-equipped armored formations against the American 4th Armored Division under Major General John S. Wood. The Panther tank carried a longer-barreled 75mm gun than the American M4 Sherman and held a theoretical advantage at longer ranges on open ground. What Araucourt demonstrated was that the theoretical advantage did not survive actual engagement conditions. The engagement unfolded in rolling terrain obscured by morning fog on several critical days. German Panthers advancing out of the fog expected to find American supply columns. They found instead the tank destroyers and Shermans of the 4th Armored, waiting at ranges where the Sherman's gun could penetrate the Panther's side armor. The encounter engagements were brutal and often short. American crews who had learned in training and in combat how to close the distance rather than trade fire at range, how to use terrain folds and smoke, how to call artillery before the Germans could reload or redirect, used that knowledge methodically across 10 days of fighting. The 9th Tactical Air Command under Major General Elwood Quesada struck German armoured columns before they reached their attack positions on multiple days, breaking up concentrations the offensive required. The airfield at Araucourt that American forces were using was close enough to the fighting that pilots could land, rearm, and return to the battle within the hour. German tankers reported in their after-action accounts that American fighter bombers appeared over forming concentrations within minutes of German vehicles leaving cover, a response time that was not coincidental. The American air-ground coordination that had been refined from the early failures of the Tunisian campaign through Operation Cobra had produced a system where ground unit radio communication with airborne controllers overhead to routine, and where the fighter bomber was as much a fire support asset as the artillery. Divisional artillery broke up German assembly areas and reinforcement columns in the rear, while the engagement was decided at the front. Over 10 days, the counter-offensive was shattered. Estimates of German armoured vehicle losses in the battle run to around 250 to 260 armoured vehicles, a figure that includes tanks knocked out, abandoned, and broken down during operations, against losses for the 4th Armoured of roughly 50. Araucourt is not a famous battle in the American public memory. It is a well-known one among professionals, because what it demonstrated is precisely the question at the center of Mellenthin's memoir, whether American tactical and operational skill was a real thing or simply the product of material advantage. At Araucourt, outnumbered American armor operating with combined arms coordination defeated a German armored counteroffensive whose tanks were individually superior on paper. Mellenthin knew this. His book acknowledges the defeat of the Araucourt counteroffensive without dwelling on what it implied about his argument. The German difficulty at Araucourt was not only the quality of the opposition, it was also fuel. The 8th Air Force's strategic bombing campaign against German synthetic fuel production, targeting hydrogenation plants at Leuna, Pollitz, Bohlen, and other facilities from the spring of 1944 onward, had cut German aviation fuel output by roughly 70% by the summer of 1944, according to the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, and armoured vehicle fuel was affected by related disruptions to the same refining and distribution system. German armoured counterattacks in the autumn of 1944 were routinely conducted with tank commanders, told to advance until fuel ran out and wait for resupply that might or might not arrive. The tactical skill of the individual German panzer crew was not the constraint. The fuel to keep the tank moving was. Mellenthin wrote of the logistical reality in Panzer Battles without quite confronting what had produced it. The bombing campaign that had made German offensive operations an exercise in fuel arithmetic was executed by the same institutions, following the same methodical logic that had applied the carpet bombing at Cobra, the same method, scaled from the tactical to the strategic level. Mellenthin and Balk were both relieved in November of 1944 following the Baccarat counterattack failure. No staff chief and no army group commander could have produced a different outcome with the formations available against the weight that was coming. The relief changed nothing except the names at the top. In December of 1944, Mellenthin took command of the 9th Panzer Division, and the last German offensive in the west began. Operation Watch on the Rhine, launched on the 16th of December 1944, sent 3 German armies through the Ardennes forest toward the Meuse River, and, beyond it, the port of Antwerp, cutting off the Allied armies in Belgium and the Netherlands, forcing a political settlement on the Western Front before the war reached German soil. That was the plan. The man commanding the 5th Panzer Army, the central force, and the one entrusted with the deepest penetration, was General der Panzertruppe Hasso Friedrich von Manteuffel. Manteuffel was born on 14 January 1897 and died on 24 September 1978. He had commanded 5th Panzer Army since September of 1944, and in March of 1945 was transferred to command the 3rd Panzer Army on the Eastern Front for the final weeks of the war. He was one of the officers Liddell Hart interviewed most extensively, and his account of the Ardennes appears in the German General's Talk, the American edition of Liddell Hart's compilation, published by William Morrow in 1948. Manteuffel and Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, had both argued that the Antwerp objective was unattainable. They proposed what they called the small solution, a more limited encirclement designed to destroy the American First Army east of the Meuse, a goal they believed was operationally achievable within the available force. They were overruled. Hitler wanted Antwerp. The German command knew, going into the offensive, that several conditions the plan required were not met. German panzer divisions were at reduced strength. Fuel allocations were below the minimum the plan needed to reach the Meuse. The weather window that would suppress Allied air power would not last indefinitely. Model and Manteuffel had calculated that the small solution could succeed even with these constraints. The large solution could not. The record of their planning arguments, preserved in Army Group B war diary entries and reflected in Manteuffel's post-war accounts, shows German senior officers who went into the Ardennes offensive already believing the objective was wrong and the margin was too thin. What this means, when you set it alongside the American resistance that actually developed, is that the German offensive was not stopped purely by American tactical excellence, impressive as the performance at Elsenborn, St. Vith, and Bastogne was. It was stopped in part by German commanders executing a plan they had told their superiors was operationally unsound, with resources they had told their superiors were insufficient, against an enemy they had been underestimating for 6 months on the basis of assumptions that Tunisia had never justified and that Cobra had already demolished. Manteuffel's account in the German General's Talk carries this subtext throughout. He is explaining a failure, but the failure he is most carefully explaining is not the one he says it is. The one he says it is involves Hitler's Antwerp objective and the fuel shortage. The one the document actually records involves a German operational culture that had misread what the American army had become by the time it crossed the German border. What happened instead is fixed in the operational record and cannot be softened by testimony from any side. On the northern shoulder, the American 5th Corps under Major General Leonard Guerreau held the high ground of the Elsenborn Ridge with the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions. The 2nd Division had been in motion when the attack began on the 16th of December and executed a passage of lines under fire to take up positions on the ridge alongside the battered 99th. 1st Infantry Division elements reinforced the position in the days that followed. Together, those divisions denied Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army the road network its armoured exploitation required. Without those roads, the armour could not move forward at the pace the plan demanded. The 6th Panzer Army fell behind schedule within the first 24 hours and never recovered it. At St. Vith, a force assembled around Brigadier General Bruce Clark's 7th Armoured Division, reinforced by remnants of the 106th Infantry Division and other units, held a critical road junction for 6 days against the full weight of the 5th Panzer Army. The plan had not allocated 6 days for St. Vith. It was supposed to fall within hours. It did not fall until the 23rd of December, and the delay cascaded through every German timetable that depended on those roads. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division under Acting Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe reinforced by elements of the 10th Armored Division, refused to surrender the crossroads town through 8 days of encirclement. Manteuffel's forces could not bypass Bastogne without leaving an American garrison across their supply routes. They could not reduce it in the time available without bleeding strength away from the advance. They tried both, achieved neither. When Patton's Third Army turned 90 degrees north and drove up from the south, the 4th Armored Division reached Bastogne on the 26th of December. Manteuffel acknowledged in his Liddell Hart interviews that American resistance had been far stiffer and American operational recovery far faster than the plan had assumed possible. The offensive had depended on American paralysis in the opening days. The paralysis did not occur. At the critical points, American units improvised, held, and counterattacked in the time the German plan had assumed they would be inert. What is telling in his account, published in the German General's Talk, is the complete absence of the contempt for American soldiers that had characterized some German professional writing about North Africa and the initial weeks in Normandy. By December of 1944, Manteuffel was not dismissing American soldiers or commanders. He was trying to explain, with professional honesty, why an offensive he had believed was operationally sound had been stopped by the very force it was designed to surprise. The explanation Manteuffel and Mellenthin and Bayerlein kept reaching for, approaching from different theaters and different documents, was the same one. The Americans did not win in the West through brilliant operational maneuver. They built a system of war that steadily degraded the German capacity for operational maneuver until that capacity could no longer be applied decisively anywhere. Strategic bombing and fighter bombers stripped German fuel production and made road movement in daylight a prolonged form of attrition. Artillery at a scale no German formation could match made every identified assembly area a target within minutes. Logistics that kept American formations supplied through conditions that left German units rationing shells enabled sustained pressure across the entire front simultaneously, so that the reserves German doctrine required at the decisive point were already committed elsewhere, already destroyed in transit, or pinned in positions they could not leave. The brick-and-wall image is a modern encapsulation, but it is an accurate one. You do not need a single decisive blow if you can remove the mortar between every course simultaneously, until the weight of what remains brings the structure down. If you value the archival record over the legend, the subscribe button is what brings the next document into your feed. There is no trick to it. You subscribe, the next one finds you. Mellenthin's account in Panzer Battles is not a neutral document, and the scholarly consensus on this point should be stated plainly, because the audience this channel addresses will know the critiques and deserves to have them on the table. Robert Citino, whose multi-volume study of the Wehrmacht in operation from the Polish campaign through the final collapse is the most rigorous English-language examination of German operational performance in the Second World War, has identified Mellenthin's memoir as a representative example of what he calls the exculpatory genre of German general officer writing. This body of literature, produced largely in the decade between 1948 and 1958, locates German defeat in Hitler's strategic interference, Allied material superiority, and Soviet numerical mass, while systematically understating German operational errors, the Wehrmacht's complicity in the atrocities of the Eastern Front, and the structural impossibility of a German strategic victory against a coalition Germany had assembled against itself through its own choices. Ronald Smelser and Edward Davies, in The Myth of the Eastern Front. The Nazi-Soviet War in American Popular Culture, published by Cambridge University Press in 2008, place Mellenthin within the broader post-war project of German general officer memoir, writing that persuaded multiple generations of American military readers that the Wehrmacht was an ideologically neutral professional force betrayed by political leadership. The argument served the men making it. It also happened to be false in ways they understood perfectly well. A third voice on this question is worth noting. Major Timothy Ray, writing for the United States Army Combat Studies Institute at Fort Leavenworth in 1986, analyzed Mellenthin's standing fast defensive doctrine and concluded that the book omits important data and context, particularly about the performance of German units that did not conform to the operational narrative Mellenthin wanted to establish. Ray's study, Standing Fast, German Defensive Doctrine on the Russian Front during World War II, is a more rigorous attempt to extract genuine lessons from the same body of German officer testimony that Mellenthin shaped into memoir. The gap between Ray's finding and the book's reputation as an authoritative source illustrates how successfully the exculpatory genre colonized American professional military reading in the 2 decades after the war ended. Mellenthin's memoir presents Allied material superiority as a given of the strategic situation rather than as a consequence, at least in part, of political and military decisions the German military institution made and supported. He does not confront this. None of that changes what he observed about American forces in Lorraine and the Ardennes. The observations in Panzer Battles are consistent with the foreign military studies manuscripts written independently by officers across dozens of different commands, with the American official histories, and with what Dubler and Peter Mansour, in the GI Offensive in Europe published by the University Press of Kansas in 1999, document from the American side. Where Mellenthin's analysis misleads is not in what he observed but in what he concluded from it. He argued that American success derived from material mass rather than military quality, that the American system was a production machine substituting abundance for art. He contrasted American operational method unfavorably with Soviet practice, criticizing specifically the dispersal of American armored divisions in infantry support rather than their concentration into true armored armies, as the Red Army had done from 1943 onward. He praised the American soldiers' individual courage and, in the same breath, implied the institutional framework around that soldier was something other than a military achievement. Dubler's study, built on American divisional after-action reports, unit diaries, and tactical records, documents a rapid and sustained learning process within American formations from Tunisia through the German surrender. The improvised hedgerow cutting device called the Rhino, fabricated from German beach obstacle steel and welded to the front of M4 Shermans by American tank crews in the first weeks of July 1944, solved the Norman bocage problem within weeks of its invention and was in widespread use before Cobra. The coordination of infantry, armor, artillery, and fighter-bomber support that American formations had refined by the autumn of 1944 was not blunt instrument work. It was a carefully adjusted system developed under fire against professional defensive fighters who punished every error without delay. The men doing the adjusting were not running on production alone. They were learning faster than the men trying to stop them. That is itself a form of military quality, and Mellenthin's framework had no category for it. He could not give the Americans credit for that. The post-war argument he was making required a different story, but he gave them the outcome, and the outcome is what survives in the record. Here is what the documents leave when you stand back from all 3 accounts. Mellenthin's testimony in Panzer Battles establishes that German artillery in the West was outmatched at every level, that American air power made armored concentration a race against detection and destruction, and that the American broad front strategy denied German forces the ability to concentrate anywhere because the pressure everywhere else was already beyond what the reserves could absorb. Bayerlein's interrogation transcripts and foreign military studies manuscripts at the National Archives and Carlisle establish what that system looked like at its most concentrated: a moon landscape where bomb craters touched rim to rim, communications severed across an entire front, the best-equipped German division in the theatre destroyed in a single day. Manteuffel's account in the German General's Talk establishes that the American Army of December 1944 was not the force German doctrine had modelled, that it absorbed the shock of surprise and restored itself at a pace no German operational timetable had accounted for. 3 men, 3 theatres, 3 separate bodies of testimony assembled across roughly 15 years, none of them coordinated, none of them designed to reach the same conclusion. They reached the same conclusion. What makes the convergence striking is precisely this. None of these officers had particular reason to agree. Mellenthin was a staff officer who spent most of the war in Russia. Bayerlein was a desert veteran and armoured division commander. Manteuffel was a Grossdeutschland Corps commander, whose most significant experience before the Ardennes was also the Eastern Front. They served in different armies under different commanders, faced different American formations in different terrain and different seasons, and when they described what American military power looked like, they described the same system. The fact that the description held across witnesses who had reason to disagree about almost everything else is worth sitting with. In intelligence analysis, it is called corroboration, when sources with no common interest and no coordinated account arrive at the same conclusion independently. The conclusion is more likely to reflect reality than any single source alone. What these men could not collectively agree to dismiss, they collectively confirmed. The Foreign Military Studies manuscripts at the National Archives contain dozens of additional assessments from German officers across multiple commands that reach substantially the same structural diagnosis. They argue among themselves about where individual commanders made tactical errors. They disagree on operational questions. But on the question of what the American system of war in 1944 and 1945 actually was, the assessments converge with a consistency that is itself a form of historical evidence. Mellenthin came back to the question one last time, long after the war had ended. In May of 1980, he participated in a structured military conference in McLean, Virginia, convened by the BDM Corporation, an American defense analysis firm. Seated across from him were American general officers, including General William DePaix and General Paul Gorman, who were trying to understand how to fight the Soviet army in the 1980s if war came to Europe again. Mellenthin told them, as he had told the readers of Panzer Battles a quarter-century earlier, that the American army's greatest strength was its logistics and fire support, and that its greatest vulnerability was a tendency toward set-piece operations that sacrificed operational tempo to preparation. The transcripts of that conference have been cited in subsequent American doctrinal literature. What is notable about those 1980 comments, when you set them alongside Panzer Battles and the 1944 operational record, is how consistent the view remained across 35 years. Mellenthin had formed his assessment of American military power in the fields of Lorraine, watching the weight come, in the autumn of 1944. By 1980, he was sitting in a conference room in Virginia, telling the American army how it worked. The Americans were writing it down. By the spring of 1945, the cycle had run its full course. Mellenthin was serving as Chief of Staff of the 5th Panzer Army in its final weeks. There were no reserves to concentrate. There was no unguarded hinge to strike. There was no maneuver space in which the doctrine he had spent his career refining could still operate. There was only the weight, and the weight was still coming. Generalmajor Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin surrendered to British forces on 3 May 1945. Between his arrival at Army Group G in September of 1944 and the end of the war, he had been briefly relieved, had commanded an armoured division, and had served as Chief of Staff at Army level. He had watched, across all of those assignments, what happens when a force built for manoeuvre runs out of room to manoeuvre in. He spent the next 8 years writing the memoir in which he tried to explain it. Panzer Battles was published in 1956. The University of Oklahoma Press English translation appeared the same year, translated by H. Betzler. It has remained in print continuously since. It has been assigned at the United States Army Command and General Staff College. It has been cited in dissertations and staff studies by the officers of the Army, whose method Mellenthin spent the book trying to diminish. He died in Johannesburg on 28 June, 1997. The book outlived him, and so did the method. If this record matters to you, a like helps it find the people who want the archive over the legend, and the subscribe button is what brings the next document into your feed. The men who saw America in war wrote what they saw in their own hands. This is one of those records.